Right now, in the quiet of wherever you are, let's go back a very long way. Back past Rome, past Athens, past almost everything you'd normally think of as ancient. Let's go back to a world that existed more than 3,000 years ago. A world of glittering palaces and vast trading networks stretching from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia. A genuinely interconnected international system, the first one the world had ever seen. And then, let's watch it all fall apart. Not one kingdom, not one war, nearly all of it across an entire region within the span of a few decades. Historians still argue to this day about exactly why. Tonight, I want to walk you through what we actually know, slowly, carefully, the way the evidence itself has come together, piece by piece, tablet by tablet, layer of ash by layer of ash. There's no need to hold on to any of this as we go. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that's exactly as it should be. The story will keep unfolding quietly in the background, the way it's been slowly reconstructed by archaeologists and historians over the better part of a century, and it'll still be here whenever you want to pick it back up. Let's start by painting the picture of the world before the fall, because you can't really understand a collapse without understanding what exactly was lost. Around 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East formed something remarkably close to a single, interconnected system. Historians sometimes call this the Late Bronze Age International System, and it's worth sitting with how genuinely sophisticated it was. You had the Egyptian New Kingdom, at the height of its power under pharaohs like Ramesses II, controlling territories stretching up into the Levant. You had the Hittite Empire, based in central Anatolia, in what's now Turkey, a major military and diplomatic power that had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, and then, remarkably, signed what's often cited as the oldest surviving peace treaty in history. You had Mycenaean Greece, a network of fortified palace centers, Mycenae itself, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, ruled by warrior elites and organized around a sophisticated bureaucratic system that kept meticulous written records. You had the Kingdom of Ugarit, a small but extraordinarily wealthy trading city on the Syrian coast, sitting at the crossroads of nearly every major trade route in the region. You had Assyria, rising in Mesopotamia. You had Cyprus, an island whose economy revolved substantially around one thing: copper. And copper is where the whole interconnected system really comes into focus, because the Late Bronze Age, as the name suggests, ran on bronze, an alloy of roughly 90% copper and 10% tin. And here's the thing about that recipe: copper and tin are almost never found in the same place. Cyprus had enormous copper deposits. Tin, by contrast, had to be imported from remarkably distant sources: Afghanistan, by some scholarly estimates, or possibly parts of Western Europe, transported along trade routes that stretched thousands of miles. Which means that every single bronze sword, every plow blade, every ceremonial vessel produced anywhere in this world depended on a functioning, long-distance, multi-kingdom trade network. No single kingdom, however powerful, could produce bronze entirely on its own. They needed each other. The economy of the entire Late Bronze Age world was, in a very real sense, held together by trade. And we know just how interconnected it was because of a genuinely extraordinary archaeological discovery: a shipwreck found off the southern coast of Turkey, near a headland called Uluburun, dating to roughly 1300 BCE. When archaeologists excavated it, starting in the 1980s, they found one of the richest troves of Late Bronze Age material ever recovered. 10 tons of copper ingots, roughly a ton of tin, glass ingots from Egypt, ebony from Africa, ostrich eggshells, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, pottery from Cyprus and Canaan and Mycenaean Greece, a gold scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, and even a folding wooden writing board coated in wax for writing. A single ship carrying goods from at least 7 different cultures, sunk on a single voyage. Can you imagine what that tells us about the scale of exchange happening across this world, night and day, ship after ship, for generations? So that's the world we're talking about. Wealthy, sophisticated, deeply, intricately interconnected, literate, with several distinct writing systems in active use, from Egyptian hieroglyphs to Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, to the Mycenaean script known as Linear B. And then, within roughly the span of a single human lifetime, somewhere between about 1200 and 1150 BCE, nearly all of it came apart. Let's slow down here, because this is really the heart of the mystery, and I want to walk through it region by region, the way the archaeological evidence actually lays it out. Start with the Hittite Empire in central Anatolia. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite capital, a city called Hattusa, was destroyed. Not just damaged, largely abandoned and burned. Excavations have revealed layers of destruction and fire dating to this period, and the Hittite Royal Archive, an enormous collection of clay cuneiform tablets that had documented the empire's affairs for centuries, simply goes silent. The Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, essentially disappears from the historical record within a generation. Move to the Aegean, to Mycenaean Greece. This is where the destruction is almost eerily total. Nearly every major Mycenaean palace center, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, shows clear archaeological evidence of destruction by fire in this same general window, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE. And what's remarkable is what happened afterward. These weren't just palaces that got rebuilt under new management, the way conquered cities often were in the ancient world. The entire administrative system that had run Mycenaean Greece, the Linear B writing system, the elaborate palace bureaucracies that tracked grain stores and textile production and religious offerings, simply vanished. Nobody in Greece would write anything down again, as far as we can tell from the archaeological record, for roughly 300 or 400 years. Historians sometimes call the period that follows the Greek Dark Age precisely because of that near-total absence of written evidence. Think about what that actually means. An entire civilization didn't just lose its government, it lost literacy itself. For centuries, only rediscovering writing later with an entirely different script, borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders. Now travel south and east to the coast of Syria, to the wealthy trading city of Ugarit, and this is where the story gets almost unbearably specific, almost cinematic, because Ugarit gives us something extraordinarily rare in archaeology, what appears to be a snapshot of the exact moment of collapse, frozen in clay. Ugarit was destroyed by fire and never resettled sometime in the early 12th century BCE, and in the ruins, archaeologists found a set of cuneiform tablets that had been baked hard, preserved almost perfectly by the very fire that destroyed the city. Among them are letters that appear to have been written in the final days before the city fell, letters that were apparently still sitting in the kiln, unfired and undelivered when the end came.
One letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus describes enemy ships attacking the coastline and burning towns, and pleads for military assistance. Another, from an official named Eshuwara, reports enemy ships already sighted at sea. And perhaps most hauntingly, there's a letter believed to be from the very last king of Ugarit, a man named Amurapi, writing to the king of Cyprus, describing his kingdom's fleet as being away on campaign elsewhere, leaving the coast defenseless, and describing the land as being consumed, as he put it, by the enemy. The city fell not long after. Whoever was firing that batch of tablets in the kiln never got the chance to finish the job, and never got the chance to send them.
Sit with that for a moment. We are, in a very real sense, reading the last recorded words of a civilization in the final days before it ended, preserved by pure archaeological accident, by the exact same fire that destroyed everything else. So who were these attackers, these ships that Ugarit's officials were so desperately worried about? This brings us to one of the most famous and most genuinely mysterious elements of the entire Bronze Age collapse, a loose coalition of seafaring peoples that Egyptian sources refer to as the Sea Peoples. Our best evidence for the Sea Peoples comes from ancient Egypt, which, unlike the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, actually survived the collapse, wounded but intact, and left behind detailed written and visual records of the struggle. Under Pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, a date that's become almost symbolic shorthand for the whole collapse in popular history, thanks in part to the work of historian Eric Klein, Egypt faced a massive combined land and sea invasion. The great temple complex at Medinet Habu, near Luxor, contains an enormous set of relief carvings and inscriptions commemorating Ramesses' victory over this invasion, and they name several distinct groups among the attackers: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, among others. Scholars have spent well over a century trying to pin down exactly who these groups were and where they originally came from. And to be honest with you, because I think the honesty matters here, we still don't fully know. The Peliset are widely thought to be connected to the later Philistines who settled the coast of Canaan. Some of the other groups have been tentatively linked, with varying degrees of confidence, to regions in Anatolia, the Aegean, or the central Mediterranean, possibly Sardinia or Sicily. But much of this remains genuinely debated among specialists, and I want to be careful not to present speculation as settled fact.
What the Medinet Habu reliefs do show, vividly, is a chaotic mass movement, ox carts loaded with women and children, alongside warriors and distinctive oared ships with high, curved prows, suggesting this wasn't simply a raiding party or an organized military campaign in the traditional sense, but something closer to a large-scale migration of displaced peoples, families and all, pushing into new territory, possibly because their own homelands had become unlivable. Egyptian inscriptions describe the Sea Peoples as having already devastated other lands before reaching Egypt. The text explicitly claims that no land could stand before them, that Hatti, Alashia, Carchemish, and other kingdoms had already fallen. Ramesses III ultimately claimed victory in both a major land battle and a naval battle fought in the Nile Delta, one of the earliest naval battles ever recorded in detail in any historical source, and Egypt survived. But even in victory, Egypt was permanently weakened. The economic and administrative strain of the conflict, combined with everything else happening at the time, meant the new kingdom would never again reach the heights of power it had known under earlier pharaohs.
Now, here's where I want to slow down even further, because for a long time, the popular story of the Bronze Age collapse was simply, the Sea Peoples did it. Mysterious invaders swept through and toppled a golden age, full stop. But that explanation, while dramatic, doesn't actually hold up well under close historical scrutiny, and modern scholars, Eric Klein's influential book on the subject is really the touchstone work here, have moved toward a much more complex and honestly more unsettling explanation. Not a single cause, but what's often called a systems collapse, a cascade of multiple interacting pressures, each one making the others worse, until the entire interconnected system simply could not hold itself together anymore. Let's walk through the other pressures one at a time, because each one on its own might have been survivable. Together, they may have been catastrophic.
First, climate. There's a growing body of paleoclimate evidence drawn from things like sediment cores, pollen analysis, and isotope studies from cave formations, suggesting the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a significant, sustained period of drought beginning sometime in the 13th century BCE and continuing for perhaps a century or more. Some researchers have described this as one of the most severe aridification events of the entire Holocene in that region. And in an agricultural world entirely dependent on rainfall for grain production, a drought lasting decades isn't a bad season. It's an existential threat to the food supply of an entire civilization. Second, and directly connected, famine. We actually have direct textual evidence of food shortages during this exact period. Hittite records mention grain shipments from Egypt intended to relieve famine conditions in Anatolia, a striking detail because it shows the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, apparently unable to feed itself in its final years, dependent on emergency imports from a nominal rival. When the trade networks that could move that emergency grain around began to fail, for whatever reason, the famine would have deepened with nowhere left to turn.
Our best evidence for the Sea Peoples comes from ancient Egypt, which, unlike the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, actually survived the collapse, wounded but intact, and left behind detailed written and visual records of the struggle. Under Pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, a date that's become almost symbolic shorthand for the whole collapse in popular history, thanks in part to the work of historian Eric Klein, Egypt faced a massive combined land and sea invasion. The great temple complex at Medinet Habu, near Luxor, contains an enormous set of relief carvings and inscriptions commemorating Ramesses' victory over this invasion, and they name several distinct groups among the attackers: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, among others. Scholars have spent well over a century trying to pin down exactly who these groups were and where they originally came from. And to be honest with you, because I think the honesty matters here, we still don't fully know. The Peliset are widely thought to be connected to the later Philistines who settled the coast of Canaan. Some of the other groups have been tentatively linked, with varying degrees of confidence, to regions in Anatolia, the Aegean, or the central Mediterranean, possibly Sardinia or Sicily. But much of this remains genuinely debated among specialists, and I want to be careful not to present speculation as settled fact. Fourth, internal unrest and rebellion. Some of the destruction layers found at late Bronze Age sites don't look like the work of foreign invaders at all. Some scholars have pointed to evidence suggestive of internal uprisings, populations turning against the palace elites who governed them, particularly in societies where the wealth gap between the ruling class and ordinary farmers and laborers appears to have been severe. A prolonged famine, worsened by drought, layered on top of a rigid, centrally controlled economic system that some scholars believe left ordinary people with very little flexibility or reserve of their own. That's exactly the kind of pressure that can, eventually, turn inward.
Fifth, the breakdown of trade itself. Remember that copper and tin dependency we talked about earlier? The fact that bronze, the material underpinning the entire military and economic system of the age, required long-distance trade almost by definition. Once instability began disrupting shipping routes and trade relationships through some combination of the Sea Peoples' movements, local conflicts, and general insecurity, the very system that had made these kingdoms wealthy and powerful in the first place began working against them. A kingdom that could no longer reliably import tin couldn't make new weapons or tools. Trade routes that had once carried grain in times of local shortage now carried nothing at all, or worse, carried invaders.
And there's one more thread, a technological one, worth mentioning, though its exact role in the collapse itself remains debated among historians rather than settled. In the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, across much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, ironworking spreads and becomes far more widespread than it had been before. Iron ore, unlike the components of bronze, is relatively common and widely distributed geographically. It didn't require that same fragile, long-distance trade dependency that bronze did. Whether the shift toward iron was a direct cause of the collapse, or more likely a consequence of it, communities adapting in the aftermath toward a metal that didn't require an intact international trade network to produce, is still discussed among specialists. But either way, it marks the transition into what historians call the Iron Age, a new era rising, quite literally, out of the ashes of the old one.
So, put it all together, the way modern scholarship largely does, not one single dramatic cause, but a convergence. Prolonged drought undermining agriculture, famine following the drought, earthquakes striking already weakened infrastructure, internal unrest as elites and ordinary people alike struggled under the strain, trade networks fraying and then failing outright, and waves of displaced peoples, the so-called Sea Peoples among them, but very likely not the only such movement, set into motion partly by all of the above, adding military pressure onto societies that were already buckling from multiple directions at once. Any one of these pressures, a kingdom in isolation might have weathered. Historians of state collapse in other cases across world history have often observed a similar pattern, that resilient, well-functioning systems can absorb a great deal of individual shocks. But the late Bronze Age world wasn't a collection of isolated systems. It was one deeply interconnected system, and that very interconnection, the thing that had made it so wealthy, so sophisticated, capable of moving Cypriot copper and Afghan tin and Egyptian gold and Mycenaean pottery across thousands of miles of sea and land, became, when the pressures compounded, a liability instead of a strength. When one part of the network failed, the failure could ripple outward, kingdom to kingdom, in a way that a less interconnected world might have been spared. There's something worth sitting with, quietly, in that idea, and I don't think it needs to be frightening, more just something to turn over slowly in your mind as you drift. Complex systems, whether they're Bronze Age trading empires or anything else, carry a particular kind of fragility precisely because of how connected their parts are to one another. And yet, and this part matters just as much, the story of the late Bronze Age collapse isn't really a story of total, permanent ending. Egypt, badly wounded, survived and endured for many more centuries. Assyria, further east, largely weathered the crisis and would go on to build an even larger empire in the centuries that followed. And even in Greece, in that long, quiet, dark age after the palaces burned and the writing stopped, people kept living, kept farming, kept telling stories around their own fires. Stories that, centuries later, some scholars believe may have been distilled and reshaped into the great oral epics eventually attributed to Homer. Tales of a lost heroic age of kings and warriors and burning cities, dimly remembering, in the shape of myth, a real and specific catastrophe that had actually happened centuries before anyone wrote it down again. So let's slow all the way down now and zoom out over the whole arc of it. A world of glittering, interconnected palace kingdoms, bound together by trade routes stretching from Anatolia to Egypt to the Aegean. A slow, grinding drought settling in over the land, tightening its grip decade after decade. Grain shipments and desperate diplomatic letters crossing the sea
in an effort to hold the whole fragile system together just a little longer. Earthquakes rattling already strained cities to the ground. Ships appearing on the horizon, carrying families as much as warriors, pushed forward by pressures we can still only partly reconstruct. And in the middle of it all, in a doomed coastal city called Ugarit, someone sitting at a kiln, pressing a stylus into wet clay, writing what would turn out to be among the very last words their civilization would ever leave behind. Never knowing that, more than 3,000 years later, in the quiet dark of a night far in the future, someone would still be listening to their story, and still, in some small way, remembering them.
You don't need to hold on to any of it now. Not the names of kings, not the dates, not the tin routes or the earthquake layers or the burnt tablets of Ugarit. Let it all settle, the way the ash itself eventually settled, the way it always does. Whatever falls, something new tends to rise up quietly in its place, given enough time, the way iron rose, in its own patient way, out of the wreckage of the bronze that came before it. For now, there's nothing left to do but rest. Let the whole long story drift, and let yourself drift right along with it. Let's go back to the Mycenaean palaces for a moment, because there's a detail in the archaeological record that I skipped past too quickly before, and it's one of the most quietly chilling pieces of evidence we have from the whole collapse. It comes from a set of clay tablets found at the Palace of Pylos on the southwestern coast of the Greek Peloponnese, written in the script called Linear B, which Mycenaean scribes used almost exclusively for administrative record-keeping, inventories, tax records, ration lists, the bureaucratic machinery of a palace economy. Linear B itself is worth pausing on, because it took a very long time for anyone to even read it. The script was first discovered by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans at Knossos on Crete in the early 1900s, and it sat undeciphered for decades, its meaning a genuine mystery. It wasn't until 1952 that a young architect named Michael Ventris, working largely outside the formal academic establishment, painstakingly worked out that Linear B was, in fact, an early written form of Greek, centuries older than anyone had expected Greek writing to exist. It was a genuine breakthrough, one of the great decipherments of the 20th century, and it opened up an entirely new window into exactly this world we're discussing, this world right on the edge of collapse. And what the Pylos tablets reveal, in their final layer, in the very last documents written before the palace burned, is a society bracing for something. Several tablets describe what scholars often call the rowers' texts, administrative lists assigning men from various districts to serve as rowers, apparently for a naval defense effort. Other tablets, sometimes referred to as the Oka tablets, describe groups of watchers being posted along the coastline, organized under named commanders, stationed specifically to guard against incursion from the sea. Think about what that means. In the final weeks or months before Pylos burned to the ground, someone in that palace was actively organizing coastal defense, assigning rowers, posting lookouts along the shore. They knew something was coming. They were trying to prepare for it. And the fact that the palace burned anyway, and that the tablets themselves survive only because the fire that destroyed the building baked the clay hard and preserved it, the same strange, tragic irony we saw with the letters at Ugarit, tells you that whatever defense they mounted wasn't enough. There's something worth sitting with in that, gently, before we move on. So often when we talk about the ancient past in these long, sweeping terms, civilizations, collapses, centuries, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that inside all of it were real people, organizing rowers, posting watchmen, trying, right up until the very end, to protect the world they knew. The tablets don't record what happened next, they just stop. Now, let's move to Cyprus, because I mentioned it briefly before, the island whose economy revolved around copper,
But its role in the collapse deserves a slower look, because Cyprus sits in a genuinely strange in-between position in this story, neither purely a victim of the collapse nor purely untouched by it, but something more complicated, a place where destruction and continuity happened almost side by side.
Cyprus in the Late Bronze Age was closely tied to a place the ancient sources call Alashiya, and most scholars today believe Alashiya and Cyprus were the same place, or at least that Alashiya refers to Cyprus or a major kingdom on it. Though, in the spirit of being honest about where the evidence gets uncertain, that identification, while widely accepted, isn't universally settled among specialists down to every detail. What we do know for certain is that Cyprus was, for generations, one of the most important copper-producing and copper-exporting regions in the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and its major coastal cities, sites like Enkomi, Kition, and Hala Sultan Teke, sat directly astride the shipping lanes that Ugarit, Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans all depended on. And we actually have a remarkable piece of direct correspondence touching on this exact crisis. Letters exchanged between the king of Alashiya and the king of Ugarit, some of which were found among those same baked tablets in Ugarit's ruins. In one exchange, the king of Ugarit writes to Alashiya, again pleading for help, describing enemy ships already at his coast. In a striking response, the king of Alashiya writes back, and this letter is genuinely eerie to read, essentially explaining that he cannot help, because Alashiya's own ships and troops are currently stationed elsewhere, in Anatolia, apparently dealing with an entirely separate crisis of their own, and that enemy ships have already been sighted near Alashiya's own shores as well. In other words, at the exact moment Ugarit needed its most powerful maritime ally, that ally was already fighting for its own survival, spread too thin to send aid. It's an almost unbearably concrete illustration of exactly the kind of systemic overload we've been describing. Not one kingdom falling while others stood ready to help, but multiple kingdoms, all under pressure simultaneously, watching the safety net beneath all of them give way at once.
Archaeologically, several major sites on Cyprus do show destruction layers dating to this same general window, particularly around the early 12th century BCE. But, and this is the genuinely fascinating part, Cyprus wasn't simply erased the way Ugarit was, or the way the Mycenaean palaces were. Some Cypriot sites were destroyed and then rebuilt, sometimes with clear evidence of new cultural influences appearing in the archaeological layers immediately afterward. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, and burial customs that look distinctly Aegean in character, suggesting an influx of new settlers, quite possibly refugees or migrants connected to the same broad wave of displacement that produced the Sea Peoples further south. Enkomi, for instance, shows destruction followed by rebuilding with new architectural features, and the site of Enkomi eventually gives way, in the archaeological sequence, to a nearby settlement called Salamis, which continues on into the early Iron Age. Cyprus, in other words, absorbed the shock rather than being erased by it, battered, transformed, resettled by new arrivals, but never fully extinguished the way some of its trading partners were.
Let's move south now, down the Levantine coast, to Canaan, the region that would, in the centuries following the collapse, become the setting for so much of what later gets written down in the Hebrew Bible. Because this is another area where the archaeological destruction layers from this period are genuinely dramatic, and where the aftermath of the collapse produced something historically significant, an entirely new people group settling into the historical record.
Sites like Megiddo, Lachish, and Hazor, all major Canaanite cities, all mentioned in various ancient texts, show destruction layers dating to this same broad window around 1200 BCE, though, as with so much of this period, The exact dating and causes at each individual site are debated among archaeologists, and not every destruction layer necessarily has the same cause. Hazor, in particular, was a large and important city, and its late Bronze Age destruction appears to have been severe and total. The site shows signs of deliberate burning, and certain religious statues found in the ruins appear to have been deliberately defaced, their heads and hands removed, which some archaeologists interpret as evidence of a conquest with a specific ideological or religious motive, rather than simple opportunistic raiding, though this interpretation, too, remains a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion.
And then, along the southern coastal strip of Canaan, something else happens in the archaeological record almost immediately after this period of destruction. A cluster of cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath, begin showing a very distinctive new material culture. Pottery styles that look strikingly similar to Mycenaean and broader Aegean pottery traditions appear suddenly in the local archaeological layers, along with new architectural styles, new food preparation practices, notably evidence of pig consumption appearing where it hadn't been common before, a detail that stands out against the practices of neighboring Canaanite and later Israelite populations, and new burial customs. This is the archaeological fingerprint of the Philistines, one of the groups named among the Sea Peoples in those Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu, apparently settling permanently along this stretch of coast in the wake of the broader collapse, bringing elements of an Aegean-influenced culture with them and gradually blending it over the following generations with local Canaanite traditions.
It's a genuinely remarkable thing to trace, if you sit with it for a moment. A population apparently displaced from somewhere in the Aegean world, quite possibly connected to the same collapse that burned the palaces at Pylos and Mycenae, ending up several hundred miles away on the coast of Canaan, founding new cities, adapting, and becoming, within a few generations, one of the defining regional powers of the early Iron Age Levant. A people who would go on to be mentioned again and again in later historical and biblical sources, remembered for centuries after the world that originally displaced them had already faded entirely from memory.
Now let's talk for a while about how modern historians actually pieced all of this together, because I think that story, the story of the detective work itself, is almost as interesting as the collapse it's trying to explain, and it might help make sense of why this remains, even now, an active and evolving area of research rather than a closed case. For much of the 20th century, the dominant explanation really was simply the Sea Peoples did it, a single external invading force toppling an otherwise stable and thriving world. It's a satisfying story, in a way, because it has a clear villain and a clear victim. But as archaeological excavation across the region deepened through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, and as scientific techniques for reconstructing ancient climate, things like oxygen isotope analysis in cave stalagmites, and pollen cores extracted from ancient lakebeds and sediment layers became more sophisticated, the evidence increasingly pointed away from any single cause and toward exactly the kind of layered, compounding crisis we've been describing.
The historian Eric Klein, whose research has become one of the touchstone syntheses of this whole period, has described the situation using a memorable image, not a single line of dominoes falling in sequence, but something closer to what he calls a perfect storm, multiple pressures converging at once, each one making the others measurably worse, in a way that no single kingdom, however sophisticated its administration or however strong its military, could have been expected to withstand. Klein's central argument is that it wasn't the strength of any particular invading force that brought the system down. It was the fragility the system had already developed over generations through its own deep interdependence. And this connects to a broader idea in the study of history and complex societies more generally, one developed by the anthropologist Joseph Tainter in his influential work on why complex civilizations collapse. Tainter's argument, in broad strokes, is that complex societies tend to solve problems by adding more complexity, more administrative layers, more specialized trade dependencies, more elaborate bureaucratic systems, and that this strategy works remarkably well for a long time, right up until the point where the accumulated complexity itself becomes a source of vulnerability rather than strength, where the resources needed simply to maintain the system start to outweigh the benefits the system provides. A society organized the way the late Bronze Age world was organized, deeply specialized, deeply interdependent, each kingdom reliant on trade relationships with several others just to keep its own economy functioning, is, in Tainter's framework, exactly the kind of system that looks unshakable right up until the moment several of its supporting pillars are stressed simultaneously, at which point the very interconnection that once made it strong accelerates its unraveling.
I don't say any of this to be bleak about it, and I don't think it needs to feel that way, lying here in the dark. I think there's something almost comforting, actually, in understanding a catastrophe clearly, in tracing its causes with patience, rather than leaving it as an unsolved mystery wrapped in myth. It turns a frightening, unexplained ending into something intelligible, not something that happened for no reason, but something with a shape, a set of causes historians have spent decades carefully, patiently reconstructing, piece by piece, tablet by tablet, sediment core by sediment core. Let's turn for a while to Egypt again, because I want to go a little deeper into how the aftermath actually played out there, since Egypt gives us one of the clearest pictures of what survival, battered, diminished, but real survival, actually looked like on the other side of the collapse.
We know a fair amount about the years surrounding this crisis in Egypt because of a document called Papyrus Harris, one of the longest surviving papyrus scrolls from ancient Egypt, compiled toward the end of the reign of Ramesses III, and covering, among many other things, an account of his military campaigns, including his own description of the conflict with the Sea Peoples. In it, Ramesses describes the lands to the north as already having been overwhelmed, describing the invading coalition as having laid waste to their homelands before Egypt itself became their next target. He describes Egypt's preparation for the assault, fortifying the mouths of the Nile, positioning troops and ships, and claims a decisive victory in both the land and naval engagements. And based on the fact that Egyptian civilization does continue afterward in some form for many more centuries, historians generally do credit Ramesses III with a genuine, meaningful military success in turning back this particular invasion, a rare bright spot of resilience amid so much surrounding collapse.
But it's worth being honest about what survival actually meant for Egypt in the decades that followed, because it wasn't a return to the glory of earlier centuries. The economic strain of the conflict, combined with the broader regional trade disruption we've already discussed, meant that Egypt's control over its former territories in the Levant weakened substantially. There's actual documentary evidence of serious internal economic distress in the years following Ramesses III's reign. Records survive describing delayed grain payments to workers at the royal tomb-building village of Deir el-Medina, and even in one striking case, what appears to be the first recorded labor strike in human history, workers at Deir el-Medina downing their tools and marching in protest over unpaid rations. Egypt endured. Egypt did not remain untouched.
And there's one more Egyptian document worth mentioning here, slightly earlier than the main collapse itself, but genuinely important to the broader picture. A large stone inscription known as the Merneptah Stele, dating to around 1208 BCE, commemorating a military campaign by Ramesses III's predecessor, Pharaoh Merneptah. Among a list of defeated peoples and places in Canaan, the stele contains what is, as far as current evidence shows, the earliest known reference to a people called Israel, described in the Stele's own triumphant language as having been laid waste, its seed no longer existing. It's a small detail in a much larger inscription, but a genuinely significant one historically, because it places a group identifiable as Israel already present in Canaan just before the broader collapse unfolds, adding yet another thread to the tangled, shifting population map of the region in these decades. A reminder that the late Bronze Age world wasn't only aristocratic palaces and trading kingdoms, but also smaller emerging groups, some of whom would go on over the following centuries to shape the region's history in ways the late Bronze Age elites could never have anticipated.
Now, let's slow down and spend a while on what actually happened next, because I think it's important, especially at this hour, not to leave the story sitting entirely in the ashes. Collapse, in this case, wasn't the end of the story. It was closer to a violent, painful transition into something new. In Greece, the centuries following the destruction of the palaces are genuinely difficult ones by any measure. Population decline in the archaeological record, a near-total loss of monumental architecture, the disappearance of writing itself for roughly 300 or 400 years. But life didn't stop. Farming communities persisted, smaller and less centralized than the old palace economies, without the elaborate bureaucratic overhead the linear B tablets once recorded. And slowly, gradually, over those dark centuries, something new began to take shape. By around 800 BCE, Greek communities were adopting a new alphabet, borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, an alphabet far simpler and more flexible than the old syllabic linear B script had ever been, and this new alphabet would eventually be used to write down, for the first time, the great oral epics that had apparently been passed down generation to generation purely through memory and performance throughout those centuries of silence. The stories eventually organized into what we call the Iliad and the Odyssey, tales set explicitly in that lost late Bronze Age world of Mycenae and Troy, dimly remembering through the distorting dreamlike lens of oral myth, an age of kings and palaces and burning cities that had actually truly existed, centuries before anyone alive to sing those songs had been born.
And those Phoenician traders themselves deserve a moment of attention here too, because they represent one of the genuine success stories to emerge directly out of the wreckage of the collapse. Cities along the Levantine coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, some of which had already existed as smaller centers during the late Bronze Age, in the shadow of larger powers like Ugarit and Egypt, found themselves in the aftermath of the collapse with less competition, and they expanded rapidly into the vacuum left behind, becoming the dominant maritime trading civilization of the following centuries, spreading that same simplified alphabetic writing system across the Mediterranean world, eventually founding colonies as far away as Carthage on the coast of North Africa. In a strange way, one of the most consequential and lasting technologies in human communication history, the alphabet, nearly all Western languages still use in some descended form today, was carried across the ancient world in significant part because the older, more complex, more centrally controlled world that came before it had collapsed, clearing space for smaller, more nimble trading powers like Phoenicia to rise in its place.
Assyria, in Mesopotamia, weathered the crisis with somewhat more continuity than Greece or Anatolia experienced, though it too shows evidence of contraction and difficulty during this period. But Assyria's core institutions, its writing system, its administrative structures, survived largely intact through the turbulence, and in the centuries that followed, Assyria would go on to rebuild and eventually expand into one of the largest and most formidable empires the ancient Near East had yet seen, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, dominating the region for several more centuries. And even Anatolia,
where the Hittite Empire itself vanished so completely, wasn't simply left empty. In the centuries following the collapse, smaller successor kingdoms emerged in the region, sometimes called the Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states, in places like Carchemish and Malatya, carrying forward fragments of Hittite culture, language, and religious tradition on a much smaller, more regional scale. Evidence that even after an empire's central authority vanishes entirely, pieces of its culture, its memory, its identity can persist, scattered and diminished, but not entirely erased, for generations afterward. So if you zoom all the way back out now, across everything we've covered tonight, across both nights really, if you're listening to this as a continuation of where we left off before, the picture that emerges isn't simply a story of an ending. It's a story of an ending and a beginning, folded together, almost inseparable from each other. The great, glittering, deeply interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age did fall, genuinely and dramatically, within the span of a few decades, for reasons that were compounding rather than singular. Drought layered on famine, famine layered on earthquake, earthquake layered on trade collapse layered on migration and conflict, each pressure amplifying the others, until an entire regional system, built over centuries, came apart in the space of a single, difficult human lifetime. And out of that wreckage, slowly, unevenly, sometimes taking centuries, something new always seemed to rise in its place. Phoenician sailors carrying a new alphabet across the sea, Greek farmers passing songs down through generations of silence until someone finally wrote the old stories down again, Philistine settlers building new cities on a foreign coast, Assyria rebuilding into something even larger than before, iron slowly replacing bronze as the material of the age, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the old system that had made bronze possible simply couldn't hold together any longer. And people, as they always seem to, found another way forward. Let's go back a little further in time now, before the actual collapse itself, because there's a set of documents that some historians read as an early warning sign, a kind of distant tremor before the larger quake. And I think it's worth sitting with, because it complicates the idea that the collapse arrived suddenly, out of nowhere, in 1200 BCE. Some of the strain, it seems, had been building for a very long time before that. These are the Amarna letters, a collection of several hundred clay tablets discovered in Egypt in the late 19th century at the site of Amarna, the short-lived capital city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten. The letters date to roughly the mid-14th century BCE, a full century or more before the main collapse we've been describing, and they represent diplomatic correspondence, written mostly in Akkadian cuneiform, the shared administrative language of the era, between the Egyptian court and various rulers and vassal kings across Canaan and the wider Near East. And scattered among the routine diplomatic business, greetings, gifts, requests for gold, are letters describing something quite different. Local rulers in Canaan writing to Egypt again and again, pleading for military assistance against readers and raiders they call the Habiru, a term whose exact meaning and identity remains genuinely debated among scholars. Some connect the word, at least linguistically, to the later term Hebrew, though most historians today are cautious about drawing too direct a line between the two, since Habiru in the Amarna letters seems to function less as the name of a specific ethnic group and more as a broader label for displaced, stateless people, sometimes bandits, sometimes mercenaries, operating on the margins of the settled kingdoms. What's striking about the Amarna letters, reading them together, is the picture of Egyptian control in Canaan that emerges, strained, inconsistent, full of local rulers begging for help that often arrived late or not at all, and complaining bitterly in tablet after tablet about disorder they felt powerless to contain on their own.
One ruler of the city of Jerusalem itself, referred to in the letters by its ancient name, Urusalim, writes with real desperation about the danger closing in around him, warning that if reinforcements don't arrive, the land itself will be lost to Egypt. Whether you read this as evidence of a genuinely fragile regional order, even a century before the wider collapse, or simply as the ordinary background noise of local politics in a large, loosely governed empire, historians differ. But it's a useful reminder, I think, that collapse is rarely a clean, sudden event with no prior history. Systems tend to creak and strain for a long while, sometimes for generations, before the final pressures arrive that bring them all the way down. The late Bronze Age world of 1200 BCE wasn't a perfectly stable, untroubled paradise interrupted by sudden catastrophe. It had already been managing chronic instability at its edges for a very long time.
Let's talk a little more about the climate evidence now, because I mentioned it before, but I want to slow down and actually walk through how researchers reconstruct something as intangible as a 3,000-year-old drought, because the methods themselves are genuinely elegant. And I think understanding how we know what we know makes the whole picture feel more solid, less like guesswork. One of the most frequently cited studies in this area comes from a team led by the paleoclimatologist Daphne Langut and colleagues who examined pollen preserved in sediment cores extracted from the Sea of Galilee and from a small lake called the Sea of Galilee's neighbor, examining, layer by layer, the changing ratios of pollen from cultivated crops like olive and grape against pollen from more drought-resistant wild vegetation. Pollen, as it turns out, is remarkably durable, and it settles into sediment in careful, datable layers, year after year, decade after decade, creating something like a slow-motion photograph of what was actually growing in the surrounding landscape at any given time. And what these pollen records show, fairly consistently across several independent studies conducted at different sites around the eastern Mediterranean, is a marked decline in cultivated plant pollen beginning sometime in the 13th century BCE and continuing for roughly a century, or in some readings even longer. Strong indirect evidence of an agricultural landscape under serious, sustained water stress, exactly the kind of prolonged drought that could gradually undermine grain production across an entire region, not through one bad harvest, but through year after year of insufficient rainfall, compounding.
A separate and complementary line of evidence comes from cave formations, stalagmites and stalactites, collectively called speleothemes, which grow incredibly slowly, layer by mineral layer, as water drips through limestone caves over thousands of years. Researchers can extract cores from these formations and measure the ratio of different oxygen isotopes trapped within each layer, a ratio that shifts in fairly predictable ways depending on regional rainfall patterns at the time each layer formed. A cave called Sorek Cave, near Jerusalem, has produced one of the most detailed and frequently cited isotope records for this exact period, and its data broadly aligns with the pollen studies, indicating a significant multi-decade reduction in precipitation across the region, roughly coinciding with the late Bronze Age collapse. When multiple, entirely independent scientific methods, pollen analysis in lake sediments hundreds of kilometers apart, isotope ratios locked inside slow-growing cave minerals converge on the same basic conclusion, that's the kind of corroboration that gives historians real confidence that this wasn't simply a colorful theory, but a genuine, measurable environmental event that these late Bronze Age societies actually had to contend with, whether or not any single one of them fully understood what was happening to their climate at the time.
Let's turn now to Crete, because I realize I've spent a good deal of time on mainland Greece and on the Near East without giving proper attention to the island where this whole Mycenaean linear B-world actually first took shape, in the earlier Minoan civilization that came before it, and whose story ties into this collapse in its own distinct way. The Minoan civilization,
centered on Crete and named after the legendary King Minos by the archaeologist Arthur Evans, had already experienced its own earlier period of dramatic upheaval, centuries before the wider Bronze Age collapse, most famously connected to the massive volcanic eruption of Thera, the island now known as Santorini, an eruption of such scale that some researchers have proposed it may have contributed to broader regional disruption, tsunamis, and ashfall affecting Crete itself, though the exact chronology and the degree of its impact on Minoan society remains genuinely debated among archaeologists, and I want to be careful not to overstate a connection that isn't fully settled. What is clear is that sometime in the following century or so, Crete's major Minoan palace centers, including the Great Palace of Knossos itself, came under Mycenaean Greek control, and the administrative language of the palace shifts in the archaeological record from an earlier, still only partially deciphered script called Linear A, associated with the Minoans themselves, to Linear B, the Greek administrative script we discussed earlier in connection with Pylos.
By the time of the wider Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, Knossos itself had likely already been destroyed sometime earlier, in a somewhat separate and still debated episode. Some scholars place its final destruction as early as the 14th century BCE, considerably before the main collapse further to the north and east. But other, smaller settlements across Crete do show destruction and disruption within that same broader window as the rest of the Mycenaean world. And in the centuries that followed, the archaeological record on Crete shows a pattern seen elsewhere across this shattered world. Populations moving away from vulnerable coastal and lowland sites and resettling in smaller, more defensible locations, often in higher, more remote terrain. A pattern archaeologists sometimes describe across multiple regions affected by the collapse as a general retreat toward what's often called refuge settlements, places chosen less for economic convenience and more for basic physical safety, in a world where the old, open, trade-dependent lowland way of life no longer felt secure.
And this pattern of highland resettlement brings us to one more thread worth following, back in Canaan, because it connects directly to a population we touched on only briefly before, in relation to the Merneptah Stele. In the central highlands of Canaan, archaeologists have documented a genuinely striking wave of new, small agricultural village settlements appearing during the period immediately following the collapse, roughly across the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. Hundreds of small sites, largely without the fortifications, palaces, or luxury goods that had characterized the wealthier Canaanite lowland city-states of the preceding Late Bronze Age. These highland villages tend to show a fairly simple, self-sufficient agricultural economy, distinctive house architecture, sometimes called the four-room house, and again, notably little evidence of pig bones in their food remains, in contrast to the Philistine sites we discussed earlier along the coast. Archaeologists and historians generally connect this highland settlement wave to the emergence of early Israel as a distinct society in the region, though, as with so much of this period, the exact relationship between this archaeological pattern and the origins described in later biblical tradition remains an area of active, sometimes quite contentious scholarly discussion, and I don't think it does anyone a service to present it as more settled than it actually is among historians. What does seem reasonably well supported by the archaeological evidence, though, is the broader pattern connecting all of this together. Across a wide swath of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, in the wake of the Late Bronze Age collapse, the old model of centralized, palace-controlled, coastal, trade-dependent city-states gave way in region after region to smaller, more dispersed, more self-sufficient agricultural communities, often in less exposed terrain, at least for a generation or two, until enough stability returned for new, larger political structures to gradually reform on top of that foundation. Let's spend a little more time now on the technological side of the story, on iron itself, because I mentioned the transition before somewhat briefly, and I think it deserves a slower look, because it's a genuinely interesting case of a technology that existed, in a limited way, long before the collapse,
and only became truly dominant because of the very crisis we've been describing. Ironworking wasn't actually invented in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. Small quantities of worked iron, often meteoric in origin, meaning it came from iron-nickel meteorites rather than mined and smelted ore, appear in the archaeological record going back many centuries earlier, treated as a rare, almost precious material, sometimes even more valuable than gold, given as diplomatic gifts between kings. The Hittites, in particular, are believed to have had some early knowledge of iron smelting from terrestrial ore, though the degree to which they controlled or monopolized this technology, once a popular theory in older scholarship, is now viewed with considerably more caution by historians, since worked iron objects do appear in small numbers in various parts of the wider Near East even before the Hittite Empire's collapse.
That changes after the collapse isn't the invention of ironworking itself, but its rapid spread and adoption as a practical, everyday material for tools and weapons, replacing bronze across much of the region within a few generations. And the most persuasive explanation for why that shift happened when it did connects directly back to everything we've already discussed about the fragility of the bronze trade network. Bronze, remember, required both copper and tin in particular had to travel enormous distances along trade routes that were now disrupted, insecure, or simply gone. Iron ore, by contrast, while requiring a more demanding smelting process, higher furnace temperatures, more sophisticated technique to work the metal without it becoming brittle, was geologically common and widely available in many regions without requiring any long-distance trade dependency at all. In a fractured, unstable world where the old international trade networks could no longer be relied upon, a metal you could source and work locally, entirely within your own territory, held an obvious and increasingly urgent appeal, whatever its technical drawbacks compared to well-made bronze. Necessity, in other words, drove adoption, and metalworkers across the region, through trial and error over probably a couple of generations, gradually solved the technical challenges of producing iron tools and weapons reliably enough to make the switch permanent. By around 1000 BCE, iron had become the dominant metal for tools and weapons across most of the region, marking the definitive beginning of what archaeologists call the Iron Age, a new era built, in a very real sense, on the ashes and the lessons of the collapse that came before it.
There's a kind of quiet resilience in that story, if you sit with it for a while. A civilization loses the very trade network that made its dominant technology possible, and rather than simply grinding to a halt, entire regions of skilled craftspeople, over the following decades, work out how to build essentially the same category of tools and weapons using an entirely different, more locally available material. Nobody sat down and planned the Iron Age. It emerged unevenly, region by region, out of pure practical necessity, out of blacksmiths and metalworkers solving the problem right in front of them, one furnace at a time.
Let's bring all of these threads together now, one more time, and let the whole shape of it settle. A world of interlocking kingdoms and city-states, already showing signs of strain a century before the final collapse, as the Amarna letters reveal, with local rulers in Canaan pleading for help against raiders even then. A slow, decades-long drought, confirmed by pollen buried in ancient lake sediments and by mineral layers accumulating drop by drop inside dark limestone caves. Famine following the drought, so severe that even the mighty Hittite Empire had to beg Egypt for emergency grain. Earthquakes striking cities already weakened by hunger and unrest. Trade routes fraying, then failing outright, as the diplomatic letters between Ugarit and Elashia so vividly show. Two allies, each one already too overwhelmed by their own crises to help the other. Waves of displaced peoples, driven by all of the above, moving by land and by sea, converging in some cases on Egypt's own shores. Palaces burning, one after another, from Hattusa to Pylos to Ugarit, their final administrative records baked accidentally into permanence by the very fires that ended them. And then, slowly, unevenly, over the following decades and centuries, highland villages taking root in Canaan, Phoenician sailors carrying a new alphabet out across the Mediterranean, Greek communities eventually finding their way back to writing after centuries of silence, and blacksmiths, region by region, quietly working out how to forge a harder, more available metal that owed nothing to the broken trade networks of the world that came before it.
None of this needs to stay with you now. Let the rowers of Pylos rest at their posts. Let the letters between Ugarit and Alashia settle back into the clay they were written on thousands of years ago, in a crisis that has long since passed, resolved, however painfully, into whatever came next. That's the pattern, really, underneath everything we've traced tonight. Strain and collapse, and then, given enough time, something new quietly beginning to take root in the wreckage. You don't have to hold on to any of it, any more than the world itself did. Just let it settle, and let yourself settle along with it. Sleep well.